Hey, everybody. This is the first episode of In and Out of Print. So, this podcast is basically about me sharing with you some of the Batman comics and trades I've collected over the years that have just been sitting on my shelf. And I want to tell you some of these stories because I think they're great stories. And, you know, nobody else seems to be doing this. So, it seems like a good idea. So, let's get started. All right, so the first one today is called Batman Gothic. Batman Gothic is a Grant Morrison and Klaus Jensen piece of work, and I love Grant Morrison. I follow Grant Morrison for many years, so most of the things you're going to hear me talk about on this podcast and pieces they're from Grant Morrison. So here's the written introduction by F. Paul Wilson. In Gothic, Grant Morrison and Klaus Janson offer us a classic story of a Faustian bargain centering around not one but two examples of the Gothic school of architecture: a monastery, ancient and sunken, keeping hidden in an ancient atrocity, and a newer piece, a cathedral built 2 centuries ago in Gotham, hiding an atrocity in the making, a clockwork cathedral, a lithic time bomb waiting to transfer a horror from the past to the streets of today. So, Batman Gothic is a comic that I don't believe it's in print anymore, but it's a comic that I like the story. I would love to see them make a movie out of this because it's just really well done. It's got some rough edges as far as the story goes. The artwork in it's very well drawn. I love it. It's set up with the villain called Mr. Whisper. And so if you want to read this and you don't want any spoilers, this podcast ain't for you. But if you want to know like kind of a summation of this thing, well, here we go. So what's the price going for a soul? All right, well, in some years ago, in this story, was a monk at a monastery. And this monk was pretty faithful to God, and until he got the plague. And his fellow monks did as well. So he took out a piece of string and he measured his shadow. And it was something like, I believe in the book it says it was like 300, I don't know, meters. I don't know. Got me. You can read the story and see for yourself. But 300 is the number that it comes out in a measurement of. And he basically binds his shadow to this twine and makes a deal with the devil for 300 years of life, or I believe 300 souls. So he gets 300 years of eternal life, cured from this plague, and then, he has to provide Satan 300 souls, or he forfeits. So he's in the monastery with his bros. That's right, I said that. And he pretty much, they do whatever they want. All kinds of debauchery occurs. So some nuns show up. And it's not a scene that's really drawn graphically. There's no nudity in this. There's not a lot of blood in this. There is some blood, but it's not graphic sexuality wise. But they rape the nuns, and there's one particular nun they rape, and they kill her. Now the monastery he's in, basically a flood occurs, and it's placed underwater. And so all of his guys, all his fellow monks are dying, dead, supposedly. And this nun now will haunt this monastery forever. But up from the depths of the monastery, in a very Dracula-like style way of telling the story, he comes up out of this lake that the monastery is now kind of at the bottom of, and somehow goes through the rivers and makes his way to Gotham City, and helps create this Gothic monastery. And in the bottom of this monastery is the plague and that twine that he measured for his shadow. So as he's there, he's enjoying himself in New Gotham, and he is committing murders and killing kids and things because he's a monster. So kind of fast forward to Bruce Wayne, and when he was a schoolboy, his dad sent him off to school, of course, because that's what parents do with children sometimes, even today. It's kind of actually become norm. Um, but he makes a friend because Bruce was kind of scrawny, so he makes a friend, and his friend goes missing, and his friend's a short little redhead boy. And he never really liked Mr. Winchester. I believe that's the name they use for this character. Again, I'm only going to give you like the best I can tell you about this story. And you go read it yourself and you'll say, well, Jason, you got that wrong. Well, it's okay, but I got you intrigued, I hope. So anyways, the headmaster, Winchester, basically, he's using that as a cover to commit atrocities, of course, again. And Bruce gets in trouble, and he hasn't seen his friend in a while. And so they did corporal punishment then, meaning they bend you over and spank you. So when the headmaster was going to do that to Bruce, and as Bruce was bent over the desk to get his whipping, he notices in the trash can the head of his friend. There's just the top of it was shown with the red hair. So he knows his friend's been killed, and it traumatized him. Now, that's the first traumatic thing to happen to Bruce. Of course, we know what happens later. But he does call his dad. Thomas Wayne shows up, is angry, and goes and talks to the headmaster while Bruce sits outside in the hallway. And he remarks as he remembers his father, and he's telling the story to Alfred as he's recollecting everything, that his dad came out and was white as a ghost or afraid, or he just didn't look right. So he grabbed Bruce and took him home. And then that night, they decided to go see a movie, and we know what happened after that. Now, this happens, this telling of the story, backstory, or the prequel to the tragedy of Bruce's parents being shot, is told in the Batcave to Alfred in Bruce's memories, because Bruce had an encounter with Winchester when he was going under the name Mr. Whisper. So at the beginning of the comic, it starts out with a thug hung upside down, kind of like a Predator style thing, and he's having gasoline poured on him. And all of a sudden, there's this music playing. So I can imagine if this was done in a movie, this would be a really great cinematic exploration of how to use creepy music in with this story, because I think that it would work well. And the song is something Bells of St. Clements or something like that is used a lot in this. And in the beginning, that the brief backstory is that Mr. Whisper, aka Winchester the monk, was captured by the mob bosses and chained around his feet and thrown into the Gotham Harbor for 20 years. And the chains rotted or whatever, and he got loose, and now he's out for revenge. So his first stop is this mob boss and his thugs torturing this guy, and they hear this music, and they're in this shady part of Gotham City, and they turn around and he sees him, and he's horrified to see him because he's supposed to be dead. So they ended up shooting him, and he's just standing there with bullet holes, and you can see daylight, and he's just laughing, and he ends up basically just killing them all. And then as for the guy hanging upside down, well, he's not saved. He's just, Mr. Whisper has a match and is smoking and just basically lights the guy on fire as he walks away laughing, singing at the same time. So that's your opening. That is this comic. It's a supernatural thriller. It is something that is, I believe, well written. It's a bit of a horror in that way. Bruce is constantly having these dreams as this is happening. He's recollecting these dreams from when he was a kid and when he was a boy, which, eventually he doesn't really know why he's having these dreams until much later. But the next part of it is one of the major mob bosses who's aware that his fellow mob boss, competition are being killed. He's about to go out, and he's talking to one of his girlfriend or his mistress, and he discovers her dead. And then he realizes that, oh crap, this is not something that's isolated to him and his gang. It's becoming more spread. And so they start saying, "It's Whisper. You need to hear me, O'Rourke." O'Rourke is the main mob boss in this story. And my brother, they were killed by the same man. Yeah, that's right. It's Whisper. Mr. Whisper is back. And so at first he's like, are you out of your mind? And he's like, well, we need help. We got to do this. We got to call him. Whisper is back. He wants revenge for what we did. How many other guys have no shadow? Because remember, he bound his shadow to this twine. So he actually has no shadow as well as being immortal. And he said, no, listen, we need help. And I've got an idea. And O'Rourke says, we call who? Are you out of your mind? Let me tell you one thing here. You need help. We make what? So the mob boss that's on the phone, he eventually, Whisper catches him and he gets killed. Which, after he kills him, Whisper picks up the phone and talks to O'Rourke. And O'Rourke realizes whose voice it is. And basically he threatens O'Rourke, and it scares O'Rourke to death. And so O'Rourke does what the mob boss, whoever this guy was, this thug that worked for him, said that you need to make and do. And so he goes out and they build a bat signal, but it's inverted. And they shine the bat signal to call Batman. Of course, Batman shows up enraged, wants to know what that is, and destroys it. And they say, we need your help. This is what happened. Batman basically says, you made your bed and lie in it. As we all know, Batman's not going to just let something go like that, because as he's telling him what happened and what they did, which is a confession of a crime, I think Batman kind of has this, first of all, curiosity, and he goes to check it out. So we kind of go through this where he goes and he sees O'Rourke in his place. O'Rourke is eventually killed by Mr. Whisper through a poisoning, and Whisper's there. Batman and him fight, and Whisper is very strong. He is not a lightweight, as old as he looks. And there's an actor that I should have prepped for this before recording, but he would be perfect for this role if they did a live casting of this. He's been in a lot of films. I remember him mostly from the bomb that was End of Days with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he basically played Satan. And I think he'd be perfect for it. Because he actually, when you look at the drawing of Whisper and the art, he looks a lot like this actor. This actor also was in Nikita with Jane Fonda's daughter, and so he just would be perfect. My second run would be Al Pacino for this role, but it does require some stunt work and stuff. So obviously some stunt doubles would be required, because Whisper basically picks up Batman and throws him off the balcony. And his cape catches onto a statue outside, saving him, and he ends up detaching from the cape and swinging back up and surprising Whisper, and they get in a fight, and then Whisper evades Batman by jumping off the balcony purposefully and lands on the sidewalk, and he should have killed him. And Batman looks at him, looks down, and sees him get up, and Whisper looks up and says, I know you. Batman says, I know you too. So the jig is up. They know each other. They know who they are, just like that. Batman's mask was not taken off. It's just that familiarity. So the story kind of kicks off from there. It's got some dry humor within it, like when Whisper hits the sidewalk, he just goes, ow. And so it's pretty much, in that way. But that's about the limit you're going to get from it. But he doesn't hurt Batman too badly, but he does give him a good wallop on the head as he goes back to the Batcave for a drink of something and talks to Alfred and proceeds to tell this story that I mentioned earlier. But to kind of jog his memory, Bruce decides to go and visit one of his former schoolmates. And he says, I think it's time I went back to school. Well, it's always a pleasure to see one of our old boys doing well, Wayne. But I'm not entirely sure I understand why you've come here. As I said, I seem to remember a series, tape of recordings being made, poetry readings. I'm particularly interested in Mr. Winchester's readings of the Romantic poets. I would like to borrow one of the recordings, for old time's sake, says Bruce. Ah, well, you see, that's exactly what I mean. Mr. Winchester left us under something of a cloud. bad business. The scandal almost put an end to the school. There are certain old wounds, Wayne. Wounds which I would be most reluctant to reopen. I see, says Wayne. Eventually, though, Wayne does get his way and he does get these recordings. And these are recordings that are of this guy's voice. So, what Batman's trying to do, he's just trying to make sure that this is actually the guy and he's not hallucinating, because this guy would be probably dead or a lot older and definitely not be able to pick Batman up and throw him. And so he gets the recordings and he hears them. And to his surprise, he actually gets a voice, and his father's voice is on the tapes. And it shocks Bruce to the point where, as they're discussing about the location of the old cathedral, this is where Bruce is off to Vienna, Salzburg, beautiful Lake Des, with its famous drowned monastery. Sounds like a marvelous tour. What do you think, Bruce? That's what his father says, which is exactly what Batman needed to figure out where to go and figure out the history of this guy and confirm who it is, because it can't be true that somebody that like this exists. Again, it's a supernatural story, so it's very well done. It just doesn't plop it down and say, well, here's a guy that's immortal, 300 years old, sold his soul to the devil. You as the audience deal with it. But they end up doing that. Some more mob bosses die as he's gone, and Whisper, he's kind of doing his thing around the city. Sees a rose in Crime Alley, picks it up, says it's time to stop and smell the roses, and he sees this girl sitting there squatting, kind of looking up at him, and he sort of takes this homeless girl under his wing as he's going through Gotham, preparing for the doomsday, while Batman is in Vienna talking to a monk about the monastery, and then the backstory I gave you earlier comes to light about what happened at the monastery with the rape of the nun and him coming up out of the basically out of the waters with this boat. There's a great drawing, a panel that shows this. So this guy's, they've done him in a way that's setting this up to be more of a horror, like I said, thriller type thing. Batman does go dive under the water to look at the monastery, finds the ghost, gets scared to death by it, but he realizes he's just looking into a mirror. But there he discovers the cathedral, which gives him the clue that Gotham Cathedral is the tool, the mechanism that Whisper's going to use, and what the plan that he has in mind to do, which takes him back to Gotham eventually. And so as he goes back to Gotham, Batman does his detective thing, and he goes through some thugs and questions them to get the backstory, to figure out, what they did, why they did it, what happened. Turns out Whisper was killing a bunch of kids, and these, Gotham guys, in a very Whitey Bulger way, were like, no, not on our turf, you're not doing that, and they eliminate him, and he finds out about it. But after that, Batman's got his answer. He's done. Now he knows what Whisper's motives are, what his plan is, and where he's going to execute that plan. He just isn't sure about the plague part yet. So as he does more investigation into the design of the monastery, he kind of realizes that it can resonate. What can it be? What it can do? In the meantime, Whisper is breaking into the monastery, getting his twine that he captured his shadow in, kills a security guard, begins to do his thing where he whistles after he kills, and sets his plan in motion. So Batman continues to go through and look at another boss, and he finds hundreds of bodies hanging from the ceiling that Whisper has killed. All these mob bosses and thugs. I mean, he's just wiping out these gangs. And, Whisper is there, and they have another encounter with each other. And like before, it's not a pleasant encounter for Batman. He's captured, he's tied up. Kind of gets a little hokey at this part when they tie him up, put him on the old conveyor belt thing, and it's going to run through and it's going to eventually chop him up or whatever. But that you got to give them credit. I think in the movie version, if they ever did a movie of this, maybe they skipped that part. It's a little bit of a corny comic book thing where you tie the hero to the conveyor belt and it eventually crunches him up, and he's got to get away before he gets crunched. But anyway, I digress. We all know Batman gets away because you can't capture Batman, you can't keep him down. So Whisper, touring around the city, dragging along this poor homeless girl with him, goes back to the monastery. Batman catches him. They have a tussle and a fight. And eventually Whisper is stopped. Plague doesn't get released. And our hero, of course, saves the day. But the story doesn't end there. Whisper is immortal. Batman doesn't necessarily catch him and arrest him. It doesn't end that way. He just gets away. And Batman doesn't have this unfinished business, but, he basically is now left with, okay, the guy got away. But for Mr. Whisper, he goes back to his hotel and he finds sitting in the chair the girl. And the girl the whole time was Satan and is there to collect Whisper's soul. And that is the end of the story. So that is the first episode of this podcast. There will be others where guests where we discuss some of these stories and how they go. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for tuning in and listening, and I'll see you next time.